A late winter night in Wyoming. A blizzard tearing through the mountains. A husband who thinks he can abandon his pregnant wife on a frozen road and walk away without anyone knowing. He believes the storm will cover everything, but he has no idea that a hunter has already found her in the whiteout and pulled her back from the edge of death. She is not just any woman. She is the one who will survive the cold, expose every lie, and bring the truth crashing down on him. What comes next is a battle of survival, betrayal, and justice, sharp enough to make you shiver. And trust me, the ending will hit harder than the storm itself once we dive in. Tell us what time you are watching and where you are tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We would love to hear from you. The last week of winter in Wyoming carried a brutal kind of silence. It was the kind of silence that settled over the mountains before a historic blizzard. Weather alerts had been flashing across every local station since morning, warning residents to stay indoors and avoid all non-essential travel. Hannah Miles watched the snowfall begin to thicken from the living room window, one hand braced against her lower back and the other resting on the upper curve of her stomach. She was 39 weeks pregnant, already exhausted from a night of sharp cramps and waves of pressure that refused to ease. Her doctor had warned her that her due date was close. Too close. The contractions were no longer the irregular flutter she had felt weeks before. They were slow, heavy, and deliberate. Her entire body felt as if it had tuned itself to a single promise. Labor was coming. She took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. The house creaked as the wind picked up outside. Snow swirled across the front porch in ribbons. Hannah reached for her phone, debating whether she should call her doctor, but before she could dial, Ethan stepped out of the hallway with his coat in his hands. He moved with quick, purposeful strides, the kind he rarely used unless he was agitated or caught in a lie. Hannah did not want to believe that, yet the thought rose anyway. She pushed it down and focused on breathing. Ethan said he had been watching the weather radar and that the storm was growing stronger by the minute. He insisted that waiting any longer would be dangerous. He said they needed to leave now and drive to the hospital in Jackson before the roads became impossible to navigate. He tried to sound concerned, but something felt slightly off. His voice lacked the natural rise of panic or urgency she expected from someone afraid for his wife. It felt practiced, mechanical, almost too calm. Hannah did not have the strength to question him. Another contraction rippled through her abdomen and forced her to grip the back of a chair. She nodded, trusting that at the very least reaching the hospital was better than standing here helpless. Ethan grabbed her bag, helped her into her boots, and guided her to the car waiting in the driveway. The cold air slapped her cheeks as soon as she stepped outside. The wind carried sharp flecks of ice that stung her skin. She climbed into the passenger seat, pulling the seatbelt across her stomach with trembling hands. The engine rumbled to life, and the headlights cut through the swirling wall of snow. Ethan drove quickly, too quickly. The tires hissed over the thin layer of ice beginning to form on the road. At first, Hannah was too busy breathing through the contraction to notice that they had passed the familiar turn toward the highway that led to the hospital. When she looked up, the landscape outside the window had already begun to change. The road grew narrower. Trees lined both sides like dark sentinels. The lights of town faded behind them instead of ahead. Her voice shook as she asked why they were heading toward the mountain road. Ethan replied that this route was faster and less likely to be blocked during the storm. His hands gripped the steering wheel a bit too tightly. Hannah felt a knot form in her chest. Something was wrong. The air inside the car felt heavier than the blizzard outside. Snow thickened around them. Visibility dropped. The car pushed deeper into the wilderness, farther away from the main town. Hannah's heartbeat quickened as the contractions intensified. She pressed her palm against her stomach, and whispered that they needed to turn around. Ethan said nothing. He kept driving until the narrow road opened into a small clearing where the wind roared freely between the trees. Without warning, he slowed the car and eased it to a stop. The moment the engine quieted, the cold pressed in like a living thing. Hannah looked at him, confused and afraid. Ethan stared straight ahead for several seconds. Then he finally spoke. His voice was almost emotionless. He said the car had stalled. He said he needed to go find help. He told her to stay inside and wait. Before she could protest, he removed something from his left hand. A glint of metal caught her eye. He set his wedding ring on the dashboard with a soft, deliberate motion. Her breath caught. She opened her mouth to speak, but another contraction slammed through her body, stealing her strength and forcing her to grip the door for stability. Ethan stepped out of the car. Snow blew inside for a second before he shut the door behind him. Through the frosted window, Hannah saw his shape moving away, swallowed by the storm. No hesitation, no look back, no sense of urgency to return. Just a man walking into the blizzard, with the ease of someone who had already made up his mind. Minutes passed. Long ones. Uneasy ones. Hannah tried calling after him, but her voice was drowned by the wind. She tried to start the engine, but nothing responded. The dashboard lights stayed dark. The heater stayed silent. The temperature inside the car dropped quickly and bit into her skin. Fear spread through her chest as she opened the door with shaking hands. The storm roared at her, pushing snow into her face. She shouted Ethan's name, once, twice, a third time. The wind swallowed each call like it had never existed. There was no answer, only the endless howl of the blizzard. And that was the moment she understood the truth. She had not been stranded by accident. She had been abandoned on purpose. The storm raged around her, announcing the beginning of a nightmare she had never imagined she would face alone. The cold inside the abandoned SUV pressed against Hannah's skin the moment she pulled the door shut after calling out for Ethan. The wind outside screamed like a living creature slashing against the metal frame of the vehicle. She shivered uncontrollably as she lowered herself back into the passenger seat. The temperature had dropped so quickly that her breath came out in pale clouds that drifted in front of her before fading into the growing darkness around her. She wrapped her arms around her stomach and tried to steady the rising panic in her chest. Her body felt heavy and weak, and the deep ache of another contraction tightened around her from the inside, squeezing her breath into short gasps. She leaned forward and pressed the ignition button, desperate for the heater to come back to life. But the dashboard remained completely dark. No sound, no click, no light. She pressed it again, then a third time, her fingers trembling as she realized the engine was not responding at all. Her pulse began to race. She had heard the engine running earlier, and it had not shown any warning signs. She did not want to believe it, but a chilling thought crept into her mind. Something was wrong with the car itself, not just the weather. Her breathing grew uneven as she fumbled toward the small compartment near her knees. She remembered that Ethan had leaned toward the lower part of the dashboard before stepping out. Her heart squeezed as the possibility formed. She reached under the panel with shaking hands and felt around for anything loose or out of place. Her fingertips brushed against an empty slot where a fuse should have been. The realization struck her with brutal clarity. Ethan had removed it. The car was not broken. It was disabled. He had done it intentionally. A violent shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She tried the ignition again, even though she knew it would not help. The silence inside the cabin wrapped around her like an icy hand. Tears blurred her vision as she pressed her palm firmly against her stomach. The contraction that followed was deeper than the last one, sharp enough to knock the air out of her lungs. She curled forward with a pained cry, trying to breathe through the wave until it finally loosened its grip. She sat up slowly, wiping the moisture from her eyelashes. Her fingers brushed against the small storage compartment above the glove box, and she opened it to find some tissues. As she pulled a few sheets out, something hard and unfamiliar slid forward. A phone. Not her phone. Not Ethan's regular phone either. It was a second phone she had never seen before. Her pulse throbbed in her ears as she picked it up. The screen flickered to life as her thumb brushed across the surface. Dozens of unread messages filled the display. The first one opened automatically. Her eyes moved across the words with growing horror. It was from Lydia, the woman she had once suspected but never had the strength to confront. The message read, "Tonight is perfect. The storm will hide everything. She will not make it through this." Another message followed. "After this, we can leave without consequences." She felt her entire body go rigid. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. She scrolled further. Each message cut deeper than the last. "Hannah does not deserve anything. She is holding you back. When she is gone, we can finally leave together." Hannah clutched the phone to her chest as another contraction struck, forcing her to lean sideways and brace herself against the seat. When the pain finally eased enough for her to lift her head, tears streamed freely down her frozen cheeks. She stared at the windshield where the blizzard raged so fiercely that she could barely see the outline of the trees anymore. The world outside the car was a blur of white and dark movement, a cold expanse filled with danger and silence. She pressed her back against the seat and forced herself to inhale slowly. The edges of her vision shimmered with dizziness. Her hands ran across her stomach again, as if checking whether the baby could sense the terror building inside her. She looked back down at the phone. More messages loaded onto the screen. "Bring the car to the North Road. No one drives there. No one will find her." And then the one that ripped through her chest completely. "She is too weak to survive the cold. This is the only way." Everything inside her recoiled. She felt sick. She pressed the phone against her forehead, shaking her head in disbelief, even though the truth was impossible to deny now. Ethan had not brought her here for safety. He had brought her here to die. The cold seemed to deepen after that realization. Her breath grew thin. She tried to sit up straighter, trying to steady herself, but another violent contraction clawed its way through her body, stronger than any before. It forced her to grip the door and clench her teeth to avoid screaming. The pressure built and then released, leaving her trembling and drenched in sweat, even as the temperature continued to drop. She looked down. Warm liquid spread across the fabric of her seat in a sudden rush. Her eyes widened. Her water had broken. She pushed herself upward, terrified. Panic burned through her chest. She looked toward the window again, hoping with everything she had that Ethan might appear, even though she knew that hope was foolish. Snow slapped against the glass without mercy. She opened the door again, letting the wind tear into her face as she tried to call out. Her voice was swallowed instantly. No reply came from the dark woods around her. She clung to the door frame as another contraction tightened inside her with merciless force. Her strength was fading. The cold seeped deeper into her bones. She pulled herself back into the passenger seat, curling forward instinctively to endure the next wave of pain. The phone slipped from her hands and landed on the floor, its screen still glowing. She stared down at it through a haze of tears. The truth remained illuminated in front of her. Ethan had left her to die, and the storm outside was closing in fast. She was alone in labor with no heat, no help, and no way to escape the nightmare he had crafted for her. The realization pressed down on her with unbearable weight As the next contraction tore through her, marking the beginning of a fight she would have to face entirely on her own. The glow from the phone on the floor flickered faintly in the dim interior of the SUV. Hannah forced herself to reach for it, her fingers stiff with cold and trembling from the lingering pain of the last contraction. When she lifted the phone again, her vision blurred and cleared in uneven waves. She blinked several times until the screen came into focus. The messages were still there, waiting for her like open wounds that had never been allowed to close. She scrolled upward with a slow swipe of her thumb, dreading every new line of text that appeared. The earliest messages were from months earlier. They revealed familiar patterns, excuses, and late-night disappearances she had once convinced herself were harmless. Now the truth stared back at her without mercy. Ethan had been meeting Lydia throughout most of the pregnancy. There were flirty messages, promises, hotel check-in photos, and threads filled with private jokes that made Hannah's stomach twist with a sense of humiliation she had never imagined enduring. Each message pierced her like a shard of ice. As she scrolled down, the tone of the messages began to change. The flirtation deepened into conversations that felt darker, colder, and far more dangerous. Lydia had written about how much easier life would be without the obligations and expectations that came with a pregnancy. Ethan responded with comments about how trapped he felt and how suffocating the responsibility had become. The words struck her with brutal clarity. He had not been distant because of stress from work. He had been planning another life, one that did not include her or their child. Her breath quivered as she paused her scrolling. She tried to press her hand against her chest, but another contraction gripped her abdomen and forced her to curl forward. The wave of pressure built and held her tightly before easing just enough for her to lift her head again. Her heart thudded violently beneath her ribs. The cold seeped deeper into her body, but the pain in her heart felt even colder. She continued reading. 2 messages from Ethan appeared next. They were sent only a few hours before he had told her to get ready for the drive. Lydia had asked if he was sure the storm would come in time. Ethan had replied that the forecast showed a perfect window and that he would drive Hannah out before the worst of it hit. His message said the mountain road was ideal because no one would be out in weather like this. He wrote that snow would hide everything and that emergency services would not reach the area for hours. Hannah felt the phone tremble slightly in her grip as her hands shook harder. She had suspected betrayal, but she had never imagined this level of cruelty. She had never imagined her husband planning her death with someone else while smiling at her across their dinner table. She had never imagined the same man who had painted the nursery would now try to erase her existence for convenience. The next messages revealed more details. Lydia had asked when they would leave for Vancouver. Ethan wrote that he had already transferred most of his money to an overseas account and that the remaining funds would be moved tonight. He said he had 2 new passports ready. He said they would fly to Vancouver and then move on to another country where no one would look for them. Lydia responded with an image of a tropical beach. The caption read, "Soon this will be us free from everything." Hannah covered her mouth as a broken sob slipped out. Her breath fogged the screen for a moment. She wiped it away with the sleeve of her jacket. Her body convulsed with weak tremors, not from the cold alone, but from the unbearable realization that the man she had trusted had not only betrayed her but had calculated every step of her suffering as if it were part of a rational plan. Her stomach tightened again, signaling another contraction. She leaned sideways, bracing herself with one hand against the seat. The contraction dragged through her body with brutal force, leaving her shaking and gasping when it finally passed. She could feel her strength slipping each time the pain returned. The sensation frightened her. She feared that she would not have the stamina to survive this if the contractions continued to intensify. She stared at the phone again because Looking away felt like giving up. She scrolled further. The most recent messages were from minutes before Ethan had pretended to be worried about the weather and insisted they leave immediately. Lydia had reminded him not to forget the spare phone. She had asked him to make sure the car could not start once he left her there. Ethan had replied that he had already pulled the fuse. He wrote that once Hannah was isolated on the mountain road, no one would be able to rescue her in time. Hannah shut her eyes tightly as her breath hitched. The truth was no longer a fog of suspicion, but a blinding, undeniable reality. He had tried to orchestrate her death. He had tried to erase both her and their unborn child from his life so he could run away with Lydia. Her chest tightened with despair. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks. She felt the coldness of the air against her wet skin, amplifying the sense of helplessness that clawed at her heart. She forced herself to inhale slowly. Her instinct told her that losing control would only make things worse. She pressed her hand against her belly as if shielding her unborn child from the truth she had just discovered. She whispered apologies to the baby. Apologies for not knowing sooner. Apologies for not seeing the warning signs. Her voice cracked as another contraction surged stronger than all the ones before it. The pressure was unbearable. She gripped the seat with both hands and gasped through it until the waves subsided. The storm outside roared louder, and the car rattled slightly from the force of the wind. The white landscape swallowed the world beyond the windshield. Hannah felt a deep dread sinking into her bones. She understood now that she was fighting for both her life and her child's life. She forced herself to sit up straighter despite the pain. The phone's screen dimmed slightly, but before it shut off, she saw one last message appear in the thread. It was from Lydia. It read, "Once she is gone, everything will fall into place." Her body trembled with a mixture of fear and determination. She felt defeated, yet she also felt an urgent need to survive. She closed her eyes, trying to gather whatever strength she had left. The SUV creaked as the storm battered it harder. Hannah held her breath when she suddenly heard a faint sound outside the car. It was distant, low, and muffled by the storm. It was the unmistakable rumble of an approaching engine. The possibility of help cut through her despair like a fragile spark of light. She turned her head toward the sound, eyes wide, barely daring to believe that someone might be out there on this desolate road. Her pulse fluttered with a mixture of fear and hope as the noise grew louder, drawing closer through the storm that had almost claimed her. The storm had grown so fierce that the mountain road no longer looked like a road at all. Snow twisted through the air in thick sheets driven sideways by brutal gusts that rattled every branch and battered every exposed surface. The cold was the kind that crawled under heavy clothing and stung with sharp needles of ice. Most people in Wyoming would have stayed inside on a night like this. Most people would have known that venturing out during a blizzard was asking for trouble. But Jack Turner was not most people. Jack had lived in the mountains for more than 30 years. He was 58 years old, weathered by wind and sun, and carried the kind of quiet stoicism that came from a life spent on trails in forests and inside the small wooden cabin he called home. He had left the cabin earlier that afternoon to check the traps he had set near the ridge. The storm arrived faster than expected, forcing him to cut his route short. Now he was driving his old pickup carefully down the winding road, trying to beat the worst of the blizzard before visibility dropped to nothing. His headlights pushed through the swirling white just far enough for him to see several yards ahead. As he rounded a bend, a faint shape appeared on the right side of the road. At first he thought it might be a fallen tree, but something about the outline made him slow down. He leaned forward, squinting through the storm, and realized it was a vehicle buried almost to its windows in thick wind-driven snow. Jack muttered under his breath and pulled over. He grabbed his heavy coat and wool gloves, then stepped out into the freezing wind. It hit him like a physical blow and forced him to brace himself before taking another step. The storm muffled every sound except the roar of the wind and the crunch of snow beneath his boots. He approached the SUV slowly, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the swirling flakes. When he reached the driver's side, he saw no one inside. The door was locked, and the seats were empty. He circled around to the passenger side and raised the flashlight again. His breath caught. A woman was slumped in the front seat, her head resting against the window, her arms wrapped weakly around her stomach. Her face was pale and drawn. Her lips were slightly blue. She looked barely conscious. Jack tapped the window hard. She did not react. He pulled at the handle, but the door was locked, so he used his elbow to break the glass near the edge. The crack sounded small compared to the power of the wind. He cleared the remaining pieces, carefully reached inside and unlocked the door. Then he leaned into the cabin and called out to the woman, trying to rouse her. Her eyelids fluttered, but she could not speak. Her breath came in weak, uneven gasps. He touched her forehead. It was ice cold. He noticed the dampness on the seat beneath her and understood immediately what it meant. She was in labor. She was freezing, and she would not last much longer in this condition. Jack slid his arms under her body, lifting her gently but firmly against his chest. She was lighter than he expected, almost weightless in his arms. He carried her through the storm toward his truck, shielding her face with his coat as best as he could. When he reached the passenger side of the pickup, he opened the door with difficulty, then eased her onto the seat. She stirred faintly and mumbled something he could not understand. He grabbed the thick fur-lined coat from the back seat and wrapped it around her shoulders, tucking the edges under her arms to keep the warmth close. Then he climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut to keep the storm out. The truck was already warm from the heater running on high. Jack turned it up even further, directing the vents toward her. He watched her for a moment, studying the way her chest rose and fell. She was breathing, but badly. Her eyelashes trembled as if she were fighting the urge to slip into unconsciousness. He spoke to her again, asking her name, asking if she could hear him. She opened her eyes, halfway struggling to focus. "Hannah," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible, fading into the roar of the wind outside. Jack nodded slowly. "Stay with me, Hannah. I'm getting you to town." He shifted the truck into gear and began maneuvering back onto the road. The tires slid over the ice before catching enough traction to move forward. He drove carefully, but quickly, knowing every minute mattered. The storm pushed against the truck like a living force, trying to shove it off the road. Jack kept his hands steady on the wheel, guiding the vehicle through the narrow path of faintly visible tracks. He glanced at Hannah again. Her eyes had closed, but her breathing continued shallow and strained. She clutched her stomach weakly, her fingers twitching with each contraction. Jack felt a pang of urgency. He had delivered calves and assisted with foaling in the past, but this was entirely different. He needed to get her to the clinic. Nothing else would be enough. The road twisted and descended as he neared the valley. The snowfall thickened. Visibility shrank to only a few feet. Jack leaned forward, tightening his jaw, keeping his focus on the dark outline of the road ahead. The truck shuddered against the weight of the storm, but it kept moving. After what felt like an eternity, the first faint lights of the town appeared in the distance. Jack exhaled a long breath he had not realized he was holding. He glanced at Hannah again, whispering, "You're going to make it. Just hold on." He pressed the accelerator a little harder, guiding the truck toward those life-saving lights, carrying Hannah through the storm and toward the chance she desperately needed. The night was still fierce, but the worst of her isolation was over. Help was waiting ahead. The warmth of the truck's heater slowly pushed back against the cold that clung to Hannah's skin. Her breathing remained shallow, and her eyelids fluttered as she drifted between awareness and exhaustion. The storm outside still roared against the windows, but the steady hum of the engine created a fragile sense of safety. Jack Turner kept one hand on the wheel and one eye on her, watching the way her hands occasionally twitched from the pain rolling through her body. Her lips trembled as she whispered something too faint to hear, and he leaned closer. "Hannah, can you hear me?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Her head moved slightly, a weak attempt at a nod. With great effort, she reached into the folds of the heavy coat wrapped around her and pulled out the second phone Ethan had hidden from her. Her fingers barely managed to keep their grip as she held it toward him. Jack took the phone carefully and glanced at the screen. He saw the unread messages and the conversations she had mentioned earlier in fragments. His jaw tightened as he scrolled through the most recent lines. The words he read did not surprise him as much as they should have. He had lived long enough in these mountains to know what people were capable of when they were consumed by selfishness and desperation. Still, seeing the messages laid out so plainly struck him in a way that few things had in years. There were instructions about taking her to the mountain road. There were details about her weakness and the cold. There were even comments about money transfers and an escape plan. The level of cruelty made his stomach churn. He slowed the truck briefly and turned the phone screen toward the faint cabin light. The messages revealed everything: the betrayal, the plan, the intent. He could not believe a man would choose such a path over his own family. He looked at Hannah again. She was trembling, whether from cold or fear or pain he could not tell. Her eyes opened a little, searching his face for any sign of anger, disbelief, or doubt. Jack shook his head slowly and spoke with a steady voice that carried the weight of his conviction. No one leaves a pregnant woman in a Wyoming storm. No one. Not here. Not ever. The certainty in his tone seemed to ease something inside her. Hannah exhaled shakily, letting her eyes fall closed again, as if trusting that she was no longer completely alone. Jack placed the phone in the cup holder and tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He pressed the accelerator harder, determined to get her out of the mountains before the storm grew even worse. The road twisted downward in long curves. Snow continued to fall in thick waves that made visibility difficult, but Jack navigated the terrain with the confidence of someone who had driven those roads through far worse conditions. The wind tugged at the truck, pushing it sideways at times, but he held steady. He spared another quick glance at Hannah. Her breathing was becoming more erratic. Her hands clutched her stomach more often. The urgency grew with every mile they traveled. After a long stretch of rough road, the lights of the small town finally appeared through the storm. They glowed faintly through the swirling snow, creating a guide for the final part of the journey. Relief washed over Jack, though he did not let it distract him. He drove straight toward the clinic near the center of town. It was a modest building, but staffed with capable professionals who had handled more emergencies than anyone could count. In a rural area like this, the clinic functioned as the first line of survival. He parked the truck near the entrance and hurried around to the passenger side. The wind whipped at his coat as he opened the door and leaned inside. "Hannah, we're here. I'm going to carry you inside." She barely nodded. Her skin was pale and damp with sweat. He slid one arm behind her shoulders and the other beneath her knees, lifting her gently but firmly. She let out a small cry as another contraction struck. Jack tightened his hold to steady her and moved quickly toward the clinic doors. They swung open as he approached, pushed by a nurse who had seen the truck arrive. She gasped when she saw Hannah's condition and immediately called for help. Two medical staff members rushed over with a gurney and guided Jack in placing her onto it. They pushed her down the hallway with swift, precise movements. Jack stepped aside only when the doors to the emergency room shut firmly in front of him. For a moment, he stood still, watching through the narrow window. The doctors surrounded her. One checked her blood pressure, another adjusted an oxygen mask over her face. A third shouted instructions for warming blankets. They moved with coordination and urgency, creating an atmosphere filled with controlled tension. Jack could hear pieces of their conversation through the glass. Words like hypothermia and accelerated labor and unstable pressure reached him clearly enough to heighten his worry. He moved back into the hallway and ran a hand over his face. The warmth of the clinic contrasted sharply with the storm outside, but his mind remained focused on the danger she had faced. He had seen many difficult things in his lifetime, but leaving a woman in this state alone in such conditions was beyond anything he could accept. He paced the hallway once before settling near the wall, his arms crossed reluctantly. He did not want to leave. He would not leave. Not until he knew she was going to survive. As he waited, the doors opened again, and a staff member quickly approached him. She asked him questions about where he had found Hannah, how long she had been in the cold, and whether anyone else had been nearby. Jack answered everything as clearly as he could. When she asked about the phone, he hesitated briefly, then retrieved it from his coat pocket. "This needs to go to the sheriff," he said. "Right away." The nurse nodded and rushed the phone toward the front desk where law enforcement could be contacted. Minutes later, Sheriff Briggs arrived with 2 deputies. His presence brought a shift in the atmosphere. Jack handed him the phone without hesitation and explained what he had seen. The sheriff scrolled through the messages, his expression darkening. He whispered something to his deputies, who immediately stepped aside to begin the formal process of gathering evidence. Briggs thanked Jack with a firm handshake and said he would begin the investigation immediately. Jack simply nodded. He turned his attention back toward the emergency room door, waiting for any sign of news, hoping the woman he had pulled from the storm would survive the night. The small-town sheriff's office was quiet when the call came in. Outside, the storm still shook the windows and hummed against the roof like a restless animal. Inside, Sheriff Nolan Briggs sat behind his cluttered desk, reviewing paperwork from a minor traffic incident earlier in the day. His deputies were scattered through the station, most of them expecting nothing more than routine winter emergencies. But the moment the phone rang at the front desk and the receptionist called his name with urgency, the atmosphere shifted. Briggs stepped out into the hallway, and the receptionist handed him the clinic's report. Hannah Miles had been found barely conscious. She was suffering from hypothermia. She was in active labor. She had been abandoned on a mountain road during a blizzard with clear evidence of foul play. The receptionist added that Jack Turner had provided a second phone full of messages implicating the husband. Briggs's jaw tensed as he flipped open the phone, now sealed in an evidence bag. Even through the plastic, he could see enough of the text threads to understand what he was looking at. Messages outlining a plan to bring a pregnant woman onto an isolated mountain road. Messages discussing the severity of the storm and the likelihood she would not survive. Messages referencing money transfers and travel arrangements for a sudden departure. All of it pointed toward premeditation. He snapped the bag shut and called over his deputies. "I need confirmation on travel records for Ethan Miles. Check every airline. He will not be sitting tight in town after something like this." The deputies scattered through the room, typing rapidly on their computers, calling nearby airports, checking ticket logs. It did not take long before one of them raised his hand. "Sheriff, we have something. There is a reservation under Ethan Miles for a flight tonight. 11:20. Destination Vancouver. One-way ticket." Briggs narrowed his eyes and asked for the rest. Another deputy responded quickly. Ethan had transferred almost all his financial assets earlier that day to an offshore account registered under a corporate shell. The timing matched the messages on the phone. Everything suggested that Ethan was planning to leave the country before authorities realized what had happened to his wife. Briggs gave his orders without hesitation. Freeze every account with his name on it. Alert airport security. No one lets him through a single checkpoint. And put a notice out on all highway exits. The deputies got to work immediately. Phone lines started ringing. Keyboards clicked in rapid bursts. The normally quiet sheriff's office turned into a coordinated command center, each member working with a sense of urgency. Briggs walked to the window and stared out into the swirling snow, knowing that Ethan was somewhere out there, likely unaware that his plan had completely fallen apart. Across town, inside a warm hotel suite, far from the chaos of the sheriff's office, Ethan and Lydia were curled on a couch. They had spent most of the day drinking wine, convinced that the storm outside ensured the success of their plan. Lydia held a glass in her hand as she laughed at a show on television, unaware of the news segment coming up next. When the broadcast shifted, the reporter's voice changed tone. Breaking news! A local woman has been found alive after being stranded in the blizzard. The woman, identified as Hannah Miles, is currently receiving emergency treatment at the Jackson Clinic. Lydia's smile froze on her face. Ethan sat up sharply, nearly dropping his glass. Lydia reached for the remote with trembling fingers and raised the volume. The reporter continued explaining that Jack Turner had found Hannah on a mountain road and that authorities were investigating how she had been left there. Ethan's chest rose and fell rapidly. His disbelief turned quickly into rage. She was supposed to die out there. This cannot be happening. She was supposed to die. Lydia stared at him, fear widening her eyes. What are we going to do? They will know. They will see the messages. We need to go. We need to go now. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, gripping it so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He threw his glass against the wall, sending shards across the floor. Lydia jumped, but did not speak. The television continued playing in the background, but neither of them paid attention anymore. "We are leaving," Ethan said finally. "We are leaving right now. Grab your things." Lydia stood and hurried toward the bedroom, shaking as she pulled clothes from drawers and shoved them into a suitcase. Ethan moved around the suite, collecting his passport, the remaining cash he had set aside, and the printed confirmation for their flight. Every movement he made was sharp and frantic. Their perfect escape had shattered, and now survival was the only thing on his mind. Within minutes, the two of them were rushing out of the hotel suite. The hallway was quiet, except for the sound of their hurried footsteps. They pushed through the exit doors and stepped into the icy parking lot, struggling against the biting wind. Snow clung to their coats as they hurried toward Ethan's black SUV. He slammed the door shut behind him and started the engine while Lydia fumbled with her seatbelt. The SUV lurched forward. Ethan did not bother brushing the snow off the windows. He simply wiped enough frost away to see the road and accelerated down the hill. The tires skidded slightly as the SUV gained speed. Lydia clutched the handle near her door, watching the storm swirl violently around them. "They will stop us," she whispered. "The airport, the police, they know now." "Not if we get there first," Ethan snapped. "We will be gone before they catch up." Lydia said nothing else. Her breathing became shallow, and she pressed her back against the seat as if trying to disappear. Ethan kept his eyes locked on the road ahead. His mind raced through the details of their plan, trying to salvage whatever he could. If they reached the airport quickly enough, he believed they could beat the blockade and slip through some overlooked checkpoint. He clung to that hope with desperate determination. Behind them, on the main road leading out of town, two sheriff patrol cars took position. Their lights remained off for now, but their engines were already humming, ready to move the moment Ethan's SUV was sighted. The storm continued to rage, but the chase had already begun. The first thing Hannah felt was warmth against her cheeks, a sharp contrast to the brutal cold she remembered from the storm. Soft beeping filled the room in a slow, steady rhythm. The light above her was dim but steady, casting a soft glow onto the ceiling. She blinked several times, trying to force her eyes to focus. Her body felt heavy, as if she had been buried under layers of snow. When she tried to move her fingers, a faint tug reminded her that an IV needle was taped to her hand. She inhaled, and the oxygen mask over her face pressed gently against her skin. The realization that she was no longer outside, no longer freezing, washed through her in a wave of fragile relief. It took several seconds before she gathered enough strength to look around. The room was small, with pale blue walls and shelves holding neatly organized medical supplies. A monitor near her bed showed her heart rate blinking in steady intervals. A folded blanket sat at the foot of the bed. Her breathing wavered as she remembered the moments before she had blacked out in the truck. The contractions, the cold, the messages on the phone, and the overwhelming fear had nearly consumed her. Now she lay in a hospital gown covered with warming blankets, and she felt the unmistakable throb of exhaustion through every limb. She moved her hand slowly to rest on her stomach, needing reassurance that her baby was still with her. A nurse entered the room quietly. She offered a small smile as she approached the bed. "You are awake. That is a very good sign. Just take slow breaths." Her voice was calm and carried the practiced gentleness of someone accustomed to emergencies. She checked the monitors and adjusted the IV line. Hannah tried to speak, but her voice came out hoarse and weak. The nurse leaned closer. Hannah asked about the baby, her words barely audible. The nurse nodded with reassuring warmth. She explained that both mother and child were stable for the moment, but there had been complications. The hypothermia and stress had caused Hannah's contractions to accelerate. They were working hard to keep both her and the baby safe. Hannah exhaled shakily at the news, her eyes filling with tears at the fragile thread of hope. Before the nurse could say anything else, the door opened again and Dr. Keller walked in. He was a tall man with silver at his temples and a calm, steady presence that filled the room. He reviewed the chart at the foot of her bed before speaking directly to her. He explained that her body had been pushed dangerously close to collapse. Her blood pressure was still unstable, and the baby had shown early signs of distress. They were doing everything possible to keep the situation from escalating. He placed a gentle hand on the rail of the bed and urged her to stay calm. Stress could worsen everything. His tone carried both warning and compassion. Hannah nodded as best she could, swallowing against the dryness in her throat. She wanted to stay calm. She wanted to stay strong, but she could not ignore the growing sense of dread that pressed against her ribs. Every memory from the mountain road returned with painful clarity. The cold, the darkness, the phone, the realization that Ethan had wanted her gone. Her breaths grew uneven and her fingers tightened around the blanket. The doctor noticed the shift in her expression and reassured her again, reminding her that she was safe now. She was not alone. She needed to focus on breathing and protecting the baby. Moments later, another figure appeared in the doorway. Sheriff Briggs entered the room with a determined stride, his heavy coat dusted with melted snow. His expression softened when he saw her awake, but the intensity in his eyes remained. He stepped closer to her bedside and spoke gently, letting her know there was no need to be afraid. He told her that they had the phone. They had the messages. They had enough evidence to confirm what she had endured. He explained that Ethan was no longer simply a missing person. He was officially wanted for attempted murder, financial crimes, and conspiracy. The words struck Hannah like a physical blow, and she felt her breath catch beneath the oxygen mask. She managed to whisper a single question, her voice trembling. "Is he still out there?" The sheriff nodded and explained that Ethan had not yet been captured, but every highway exit was being monitored. His accounts had been frozen, and every officer in the county had been alerted. They believed he was trying to flee with Lydia. They were closing in, but they needed time. Hannah pressed her hand against her stomach, feeling terror pulse through her at the thought of him being free. She asked him, voice cracking, to protect her child no matter what. Her fear was raw and unfiltered, the fear of a mother who had nearly lost everything. Sheriff Briggs leaned closer, lowering his voice with sincerity. He promised that he would not let Ethan get away. He told her she was safe here, surrounded by law enforcement and medical staff who would not let anything happen to her or her baby. His words held the authority of someone who had seen enough tragedy to understand the weight of such a promise. Hannah nodded again, tears slipping down the sides of her face. She believed him because she had no choice but to believe. Her strength was nearly spent, and she needed someone else to carry the burden for a little while. Behind the sheriff stood Jack Turner, his weathered face full of concern. He had been waiting quietly, just outside the room, giving space to the medical team, but refusing to leave until he knew she was safe. He stepped inside slowly, placing his hat against his chest in a gesture of respect. Hannah looked at him with gratitude so deep, it made her chest tighten. She whispered his name, thanking him for saving her. Jack shook his head gently and told her she did not owe him anything. He only did what any decent person would do. His voice was rough from the cold, but full of quiet kindness. Before anyone could speak again, a staff member rushed into the room, her expression tense. She addressed the sheriff first. Her words came out quickly. Officers had reported movement near the airport. A black SUV matching Ethan's description had been spotted fighting its way through the storm. Sheriff Briggs straightened immediately, his eyes sharpening. He turned to Hannah and assured her again that they would apprehend him. Then he followed the nurse out of the room, already issuing orders. The chase had begun, and the storm outside had not yet finished its work. The storm had grown even stronger by the time Ethan's black SUV tore down the icy road. Snow blasted against the windshield in thick streaks, blurring the world outside into a frantic mess of white and gray. The wipers could barely keep up. The tires struggled for grip, sliding slightly each time Ethan pressed the accelerator too hard. His hands were locked on the steering wheel, knuckles, white jaw clenched. Every muscle in his body overflowed with panic. The radio crackled with static until a sharp voice broke through the noise. A statewide alert. A woman found alive in the blizzard. A pregnant woman. A name. Hannah Miles. Ethan's eyes widened. His breath froze in his chest. The moment the radio confirmed she was alive, something inside him snapped. He slammed his fist against the dashboard, shouting curses that rattled the interior of the SUV. Lydia covered her ears, her face pale with terror as she watched him lose the last shred of control he had left. The cabin filled with his frantic breathing and the muffled roar of the storm. "She was supposed to die," Ethan shouted. "She was supposed to be gone. How did she survive? She was supposed to be gone." Lydia trembled as she held the folder containing their passports and flight confirmations. Her voice shook badly as she tried to calm him. She told him they would still make it. She reminded him that the flight was waiting. She insisted that they needed to focus on getting to the airport, not on Hannah. Ethan refused to listen. The words on the radio replayed in his mind like a cruel taunt. Alive. Found. Rescued. He ripped the radio dial to silence and pressed the accelerator harder. The SUV surged forward, fishtailing slightly before stabilizing. Snow flew behind them in long, violent streaks. Lydia clung to the door handle, her heart pounding against her ribs. She kept glancing at Ethan's face, searching for any sign that he was thinking clearly. But all she saw was a man cornered by his own actions, a man who had run out of excuses and time. Miles ahead, inside the airport security office, two officers stared at the live camera feed showing the main road. Sheriff Briggs had warned them only minutes earlier. They were to expect a black SUV matching Ethan's plate number. They were to prepare for a volatile confrontation. One officer reached for the intercom and announced that all patrol units were to take position near the entry barricades. Another officer turned on the emergency alarm system, bathing the security office in flashing red light. Outside the airport grounds transformed from quiet winter stillness to tense readiness. Patrol cars moved into formation. Officers wearing reflective jackets took cover behind concrete barriers. They braced themselves against the wind as they raised their weapons and waited for the approaching vehicle. Snow whirled around them as the storm howled across the runway and against the large glass walls of the terminal. Every second felt heavier than the last. Back on the road, Lydia spotted the faint glow of airport lights through the storm. She let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. But as they neared the entrance, her relief turned to dread. She saw flashing lights ahead, police cars, barriers, officers standing in formation. The storm lit their silhouettes like ghosts against the blowing snow. "Ethan, stop. Please. They know. They are waiting for us," Lydia whispered. Ethan did not slow down. His eyes fixed on the blockade ahead. His mind raced. Every route out of town was sealed. Every account he had was frozen. The messages on his second phone had already betrayed him. Everything he had planned was unraveling. His future, his money, his freedom, all slipping through his fingers. Fear twisted into desperation, and desperation twisted into something reckless and violent. He pressed his foot to the accelerator. The engine roared louder. Lydia screamed his name, begging him to stop. But Ethan's voice rose above hers, raw and unhinged. "I am not going to prison. I am not going to lose everything. They cannot stop me." The officers at the barricade raised their voices, shouting commands to stop the vehicle. Snow whipped around them as the black SUV sped toward their position. They stepped back, tightening their grip on their weapons. The barricade lights flickered off the hood of the SUV as it came barreling toward them. Tension snapped into action. The SUV slammed into the first metal barrier with a violent crunch. The impact sent the structure rolling sideways across the pavement. Officers dove out of the way. Two were thrown off balance and hit the ground hard as the SUV swerved, skidding across the frozen surface in a chaotic spray of ice and snow. The tires screeched as Ethan wrestled with the wheel, but the vehicle was already out of control. "Ethan, stop. Stop. Please," Lydia cried, gripping the dashboard. But it was too late. The SUV slid across the airport drop-off lane, struck a concrete divider, ricocheted, and crashed head-on into the wide glass doors of the main terminal. The explosion of shattering glass echoed through the cavernous hall. The front of the SUV crumpled inward, metal folding like paper. Alarms began ringing instantly, drowning out Lydia's screams. For a moment, everything stilled. Then chaos erupted. Officers swarmed the wreck. Shards of glass crunched beneath their boots as they approached the ruined vehicle. Steam hissed from the crushed hood. A security officer smashed the driver's window with the butt of his weapon. Several hands reached inside, dragging Ethan from the seat. He fought wildly, but exhaustion and impact made his efforts weak and erratic. Blood streaked across his forehead. His breath came out in frantic bursts. "Ethan Miles, you are under arrest," one officer shouted. The cold metal of handcuffs clamped around his wrists as he was forced to the ground. Snow blew in through the shattered entrance as alarms continued to blare overhead. Lydia was pulled from the passenger side by two officers. She sobbed uncontrollably, her hair tangled and her hands shaking violently. Cameras from the airport security system recorded everything. The broken glass, the overturned barricades, the officers restraining Ethan on the floor of the terminal, while travelers watched from behind pillars and vending machines, stunned by the chaos. Ethan lifted his head, once eyes full of terror and disbelief, just as Sheriff Briggs pushed through the crowd of officers to reach the scene. Briggs stared down at him, breathing hard from the sprint across the terminal. "It's over," the sheriff said. "You are done running." And for the first time, Ethan seemed to understand that it was true. Ethan barely remembered the moment the officers dragged him out of the shattered airport terminal. His ears were still ringing from the crash, and the flashing lights from patrol cars stabbed at his vision with painful intensity. His hands were cuffed tight behind his back as he was forced into the rear seat of a police cruiser. Snow rushed against the windows as the vehicle pulled away, carrying him toward the sheriff's station. His breathing came in frantic bursts. His jaw ached. His mind raced in frantic circles, trying to process the reality that everything he had planned had fallen apart in a single night. When the cruiser arrived at the station, the doors swung open and Sheriff Briggs stepped into the cold, his expression hard and unreadable. The deputies pulled Ethan from the car and marched him inside. His boots squeaked against the linoleum floor, leaving streaks of melting snow. The fluorescent lights overhead made the room feel even colder. Officers watched silently as he was escorted down the hallway toward the interrogation room. The air felt heavy, as if the entire station knew exactly who he was and what he had done. The door to the interrogation room opened. A metal table sat in the center, its surface reflecting the harsh light. One chair waited on each side. Ethan was pushed into the seat and uncuffed only long enough for his wrists to be secured to the metal loop attached to the table. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, his pulse racing beneath his skin. The room felt too small, too bright, too full of consequences that he did not want to face. Sheriff Briggs entered the room and closed the door with a firm click. He dropped a thick folder onto the table. The sound echoed sharply. Ethan flinched. The sheriff sat across from him, his eyes cold with disappointment and anger. Minutes passed in silence before Briggs opened the folder and pulled out the sealed evidence bag containing Ethan's second phone. He placed it on the table between them. "Explain this," Briggs said calmly. Ethan stared at the phone, searching for the right words. He forced a deep breath and insisted that everything had been a misunderstanding. He claimed Hannah had panicked and wandered off during the storm. He said he had left the car only to find help. He said the messages were part of a game. His voice cracked under the weight of his lies, but he kept talking, trying to twist the story into something that might save him. Sheriff Briggs did not blink. He opened the evidence bag, retrieved the printed transcripts of the messages, and began reading them aloud. The conversations described the plan, the storm, the remote road, the expectation that Hannah would not survive, the reservation for a one-way flight, the transfer of funds to an offshore account. Every detail that Ethan had hoped would remain hidden now sat exposed in the bright light of the interrogation room. Ethan's shoulders tensed. His words became more frantic. He accused the sheriff of misreading everything. He claimed the messages were taken out of context. He shouted that Lydia had influenced him. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the metal frame, but the restraints kept him from rising. His face reddened. He cursed. He denied. He grasped desperately at excuses that collapsed the moment they left his mouth. Sheriff Briggs remained unshaken. He waited until Ethan finished yelling. Then he leaned forward and spoke with a steady, unwavering voice. "Your wife is alive. She is fighting to survive because of what you did. You can deny these messages all you want, but the truth is sitting right here. You planned to leave her. You planned to run. And now you will face what comes next." Ethan's breath wavered. His eyes darted around the room as if looking for a way out that did not exist. The sheriff gathered the documents, and called for 2 deputies. They entered the room, unlocked Ethan's restraints, and pulled him to his feet. His legs shook as they marched him down the hall toward the holding cells. When the heavy door of the cell block opened, the noise hit him immediately. Voices echoed. Metal clanged. The stale air smelled of sweat concrete and old fear. Several inmates looked up from their bunks when the deputies led him inside. Their eyes followed his movements with sharp interest. Prisoners in small towns always knew the latest local scandal, and tonight's story had already spread. The deputies unlocked a cell and shoved Ethan inside. The door clanged shut behind him. For a brief moment, the block fell silent. Then one prisoner stepped closer to the bars and stared at him with disgust. "You're the one," the man said. "The guy who left his pregnant wife in a blizzard?" Another inmate leaned forward from the bunk across the aisle. "I saw it on the news. You left her to die and ran off with some other woman." A ripple of anger moved through the block. Inmates rose from their bunks. Their voices grew louder, sharper, more aggressive. Before Ethan could step back, 3 prisoners pushed into his cell the moment a guard turned away. The first punch came fast and hard. It knocked Ethan to the floor. The second blow hit his ribs. The third split his lip. He shouted for help, but the storm of fists drowned out every sound. His vision blurred as pain radiated through his body. The inmates showed no mercy. They struck him until he could barely curl in on himself, until he lay bleeding and shivering on the concrete floor. When the guards finally intervened, the prisoners stepped back, reluctantly muttering threats as they returned to their cells. Ethan was lifted from the floor and carried to the infirmary room of the jail. His face was swollen. His ribs ached with every breath. Blood streaked his chin. His hands shook uncontrollably. Meanwhile, Lydia faced her own downfall in the women's holding area. Reporters outside screamed her name as headlines spread across every screen. Photos from airport security flooded social media. Her co-workers released statements denouncing her. Family members refused to answer her calls. She sat in a corner of the cell, rocking back and forth, whispering that Hannah should not have survived. Her eyes were wild and unfocused. Panic warped into something unstable and haunting. Madness crept into every word she spoke. Back in the infirmary, Ethan lay shackled to the narrow bed, bruised, broken, and stripped of every illusion of control he once had. The security light above him flickered softly, casting a cold glow across his battered face. For the first time, he understood that everything was truly over. The next step would be the courtroom. The final reckoning had arrived. The courthouse in Jackson filled slowly as the first sunlight of early spring filtered through the high windows. It was the kind of morning that should have felt peaceful. The kind of morning that reminded people winter was finally loosening its grip on the Wyoming mountains. But inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with anticipation. Reporters whispered among themselves. Locals, who had followed the case from the beginning, sat rigidly in their seats. The story of a woman abandoned in a blizzard had reached every home in the region, and now the final chapter was unfolding. Hannah stepped through the side entrance, with deliberate, careful movements. Her body was still recovering from hypothermia and days of medical treatment, but her spirit had steadied into something firm. Sheriff Briggs walked beside her, protective and watchful. On her other side was Jack Turner. His weathered face was solemn, but there was nothing but quiet strength in his expression. He had not left her side since the night he found her. Now he accompanied her into the room like a silent guardian. As Hannah approached the front row, people shifted to make space for her. Some offered sympathetic nods. Others kept their eyes lowered out of respect. She took her seat, inhaling slowly, letting the calm of the moment settle into her chest. The room felt cold, but not in the way the mountain storm had felt. This coldness belonged to justice, to the weight of what was about to be confronted. The door to the holding area opened, and Ethan was escorted inside by 2 federal officers. His face still carried bruises from the beating he had received from the inmates. His jaw was slightly swollen, and a healing cut stretched across his cheek. His wrists were bound in front of him with thick cuffs. His posture sagged, not from injury alone, but from the collapse of everything he once believed he controlled. He glanced toward Hannah, but looked away quickly when their eyes met. Shame and fear flickered across his face before he lowered his gaze to the floor. The judge entered a moment later, and the courtroom rose. When everyone sat again, the session began with the steady voice of the clerk announcing the charges. They were numerous: attempted murder, abandonment during life-threatening conditions, conspiracy, financial crimes, assault with a vehicle, attempted evasion of law enforcement. The list echoed across the room, each word striking like a stone dropped into still water. The prosecution began their presentation. The lead prosecutor was a composed woman with sharp eyes and a calm tone. She moved to the center of the room, holding a folder that contained every piece of evidence gathered over the past days. She explained the timeline of the crime. She described the discovery of Hannah in the blizzard. She detailed the rescue led by Jack Turner. She presented the messages recovered from Ethan's secret phone, the conversations planning the abandonment, the flight booked for Vancouver, the offshore transfers, the attempt to destroy evidence. Every detail was laid bare. The jury watched intently. Many shifted uncomfortably when the prosecutor recited the messages discussing the storm as an opportunity to erase a life. Even the judge's expression hardened as the story unfolded. Sheriff Briggs was called to testify next. He described the discovery of the phone, the coordinated pursuit, and the scene at the airport when Ethan crashed into the terminal. His voice remained steady throughout, though a note of restrained anger appeared when he recounted the moment he saw Ethan attempt to drive through the barricade. The photographs of the crash flashed across the monitors. The shattered glass, the damaged barricades, the officers who narrowly avoided serious injury. Each image reinforced the sheer brutality of Ethan's actions. After Briggs stepped down, the room grew silent as the clerk called Hannah's name. She stood slowly, steadying herself with a hand on the wooden railing. Jack rose as if to assist her, but she shook her head gently. She wanted to walk on her own. Every step she took toward the witness stand felt like reclaiming something Ethan had tried to steal from her. She placed her hand on the rail, faced the judge, and took the oath with a clear, unwavering voice. When the prosecutor asked her to describe what happened on the mountain road, Hannah began speaking softly. Her voice trembled at first, but each sentence grew stronger. She described the cold, the darkness, the moment Ethan told her to wait in the car, the realization that he was not coming back, the fear that she would not survive, the pain of reading his messages, the overwhelming terror of understanding he had not only betrayed her, but planned the night in detail. Her voice cracked only once. She paused, swallowed, and continued. No one in the courtroom moved. Even the reporters remained still, their hands frozen above their notepads. When she finished, the judge thanked her with a gentle nod, acknowledging the courage it took to speak. The defense attorney appointed by the court attempted to challenge the narrative. He suggested that Ethan had acted impulsively. He argued that the storm had interfered with Ethan's intentions. He attempted to portray the crime as a moment of panic rather than a calculated plan, but the evidence was overwhelming. Every argument fell flat the moment the prosecutor reminded the jury of the messages that stated clearly what Ethan intended. When closing arguments concluded, the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. Hannah returned to her seat, and Jack rested a supportive hand on the back of her chair. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour before the jury re-entered the courtroom. The foreman stood. "We find the defendant guilty." The words rolled through the room with finality. The judge took a moment before speaking. His tone was firm. He sentenced Ethan Miles to 35 years in federal prison. Gasps floated through the room from those who had followed the case. Ethan closed his eyes, as if absorbing a blow. He offered no words, no apology, only the defeated slump of someone who had finally reached the end of running. The judge then ordered Lydia to be transferred to a long-term psychiatric facility due to her deteriorating mental state and dangerous behavior recorded during arrest. The courtroom slowly emptied after the final gavel strike. Reporters hurried outside to send breaking news updates. Officers escorted Ethan away in chains. Lydia was taken through a separate hallway, her vacant stare unfocused and lost. Hannah remained seated for a long moment. The weight she had carried through the storm, through the hospital, and through the trial slowly lifted. She rose, walked toward the exit, and stepped outside into the sunlight. The air smelled faintly of melting snow. It felt clean, new, quiet. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply as Jack stepped beside her, silent and steady. For the first time in a long time, Hannah felt the world open before her. The storm had passed. A new beginning was finally hers.